Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Mastering Midlife, How to Thrive When the World Asks the Most of You. Today, I have the privilege of talking to a friend, a colleague, a mentor, Clarence Thompson. Clarence has been coaching Enneagram for 15, maybe 20 years, because I think his website is old. So I think he's probably doing it a lot longer than it says there. He's a former Catholic priest. And now what we're going to be talking about is Clarence is probably the foremost authority on the Enneagram. Enneagram is a personality test, not unlike, but completely different from like Myers-Briggs that you would understand. I'm going to ask Clarence to explain that. But Clarence has taken it from a science to an art to something otherworldly. When I bring my clients to him, they walk away with gold that is immeasurable and unknowable from just the face value. So Clarence, thank you for being on the program.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's more than my pleasure. You have a fan base in the multiple tens of thousands that I know across the world because of the ripple effect of what you do. So can you explain what the Enneagram is for us?
Yes, it's a description of 9 personality styles, but let's start with an analogy. I'm going to take a trip, so I get out my Google map, and there's a particular state. Then if you zoom in, all of a sudden you see that the state is not just one block, but there's all sorts of little lines there. And then you focus in a little closer, and the lines get a little clearer and better. In a certain sense, that's what the Enneagram did for spirituality. Because in popular spirituality, basically, if you listen to your average let us homily, that is, let us do this and let us do that, what you find is, will you please be more sincere? And if I were more sincere and I would try harder, then everything would get better. The Enneagram gives you a description of your inner geography. It breaks down this notion of how to be better or how to be sincere, because we have 9 sort of rivers of energy flowing through us. And consequently, we don't ever take a one-size-fits-all. For example, Mark's specialty is midlife. Style 3, because they are workaholics, they really crash at midlife very often. Because if your identity, as style 3 is, if your identity is tied up with your role, when your role changes, it's earth-shaking. A classic example is Oprah Winfrey. She was a very high-performing 3. She was on top of the world. She had more money than God. And then, all of a sudden, her program changed, and it became therapy. Millions of women save millions of dollars by going and getting therapy from Oprah, because she changed from being this super entrepreneur to being inner directed therapist. Well, that happens to 3s quite often. They climb the corporate ladder, discover it's leaning against the wrong wall, and then they develop their inner life. Now, Mark and I are both style 7s, so midlife occurs somewhere between 65 and 90, because we're perpetual children. So midlife is experienced a little differently. But what the Enneagram does is it divides all of these crises of midlife into 9 different psychological, spiritual assignments. But I'd like to say one other thing about the Enneagram, because I like to talk in images and pictures, partially because I'm an ill-harnessed Irish poet in a workaday world, but because people understand images and analogies on various levels. 10 years ago, if you read a book on nutrition, it was all about don't eat too much, and basically food was was fuel. But then they started doing a lot of very detailed scientific analysis of chemicals. And now if you go to read a book on nutrition, they'll be talking about your NRF2 pathways and your ketones and your allergies. And all of a sudden, nutrition has changed. Food is no longer just energy. Now it's information.
Mm.
That's what the Enneagram does. It says if you want to handle a spiritual road, if you want to travel the spiritual road, you need to know in detail what the information is that you need, and you need more detailed knowledge about your inner needs. Mark and I have one set of inner needs. A style 4 has very different inner needs.
So there are 9 styles, and the way you've described it to me is it's our fallback default way of managing our energy and the way we act in the world. And it was developed at some time when we were small as a coping mechanism.
Yes. If you've ever dealt with small children, you know that what they want more than anything else in life is to get their own way. Okay. All right. So when we want to get our own way, we tried a number of things. And pretty soon we found something that works, or this worked better than that. We'd have 2 or 3 ways of getting what we want, but one was better than the other. So what happens is we become used to getting our own way in a certain way. And so when we face a new situation, we do what used to work. Now, what happens is a habit, which is what an Enneagram style is. It's not an identity. It's a description in a very kind of general way, but it's basically a habit. It's something that we do very well because we have been doing it ever since we were a little kid, but at the same time, we are unconscious. Let me give you a very simple example. Let's say you've got a 3-year-old and she gets bitten by a dog. All right, 4 years later, she visits her grandmother, who's got this darling golden retriever who just wants to be hugged and petted. She is scared to death. She is not afraid of that dog. She's afraid of the dog that bit her. She's afraid of the past. And that's why you can't talk her out of not being afraid of this dog, because she's really afraid of that old dog. Okay, now let's say you had an overbearing bigger brother, or you had an alcoholic parent, or you had whatever. As you go through life, those early patterns of habits set you up for what you expect to happen. The little girl expects that big dog to bite her. Now, our expectations are wrong. Now, behavioral science says, well, we act on cues. Those cues come from the past just as much as they come from the present. So what happens when we walk into a new situation, we expect certain things to happen. Now, most of the time,
because of our conditioning and because of our history and because of what we've decided the world is going to be.
That's right. And the Enneagram style is really a very composite habit. It starts with a focus of attention. In this case, the little girl is focusing on what could hurt her. Okay? But when you go through life focusing on certain things, and you find certain things, pretty soon you expect to find it also. Well, when you go through life expecting certain things, that's what you find. You hear that phrase in bars sometimes, are you looking for trouble? Well, yes, you went looking for it, so that's what you find. So what happens is you find what you're looking for, and you decide, oh, that's the way the world is. Okay? Now, we are not quite aware of how we see the world, but we're quite aware of how other people see the world, because we have friends about whom we say, oh, I can't tell him that, he can't hear it. How do you know that? Because in his Enneagram created world, that information doesn't fit. It may be hostile, it might be frightening, it might be irrelevant, but for whatever reason, in his Enneagram world, that doesn't fit. Okay, so now we have a model of the universe, and then we develop certain strategies to deal with it. For instance, the little girl sees the dog. What do you do? Now, are you going to run? Are you going to throw something at it? You know, are you going to try to con the dog by giving it food? What are you going to do? Well, we all set up a series of strategies. And so that's the composite of the Enneagram. It's a focus of attention. It's the world as we see it because of that focus. And then it's a certain set of strategies. I call them strategies. That's a technical NLP term. We aren't aware of it. We don't go into a situation saying, I know what I will do. Let me give you an example. You walk into a crowded room. You instantaneously make a series of decisions. Who looks interesting? Who looks frightening? What's out of order? What do I need? What can I get? We make all those decisions instantaneously.
Yes.
Okay, so that means that when behavioral science says we react to certain cues, that's only part of it. We have a we have a carefully developed whole set of presuppositions and expectations and enthusiasms about every situation that we meet. So when we meet midlife crisis, we don't all meet it the same. We expect certain things based on what happened in the past. Okay.
Yeah, and you know, when you started the conversation, you talked about midlife, how we each come at it from a different perspective given our Enneagram. I was really fascinated and want to go deeper there. But for the moment, what I want to focus on is I give all my clients to you to do their Enneagram and to have a conversation. And almost every single one of them comes back and says, oh my God, that's why I do what I do. That's why I feel how I feel. That's why I get the results that I get. It's almost like you read their tarot cards because they kind of fit into one of these 9 streams. Now it's not a lock, but you know, it's a generalization. So once they see that that's a pattern that they've developed from childhood, that's a freedom in and of itself. So when you teach people this Enneagram and you show them some of their patterns, some of them feel good, some of them don't. Now, how do you talk about that so that it's useful in their lives?
Okay, once you position the Enneagram as a habit, then you talk about first recognizing the habit and then dealing with it. It just so happens that there's a number of books that talk about habits, and it fits the Enneagram quite well. Every habit has a series of triggers. Okay, that's why alcoholics are not allowed to go back into the bar for any reason. There are too many triggers there. That's why when you go home, you feel 12 years old, because that's the age of the triggers. Okay? So a habit is triggered. Then he has a routine, or what maybe you could call it an algorithm, but he has some kind of sequence of actions that usually take place. And then there is a reward for that. So then when I go to coach people, I say, what are the triggers that trigger your Enneagram style? And then what do you do when you are triggered by that? And
What is the habitual response or behavior that you exhibit?
Yes. Yeah. See, habits are usually considered behavioral patterns. The Enneagram says, well, wait a minute. There's the perceptual patterns that underlie the behavioral patterns. Okay, so then you've got a series of behaviors and a number of things that you tell yourself, and then there is a payoff. Mark, you and I are 7, so we'll talk about it. All right. What triggers us is a fear of confinement, for instance. We don't like to have all the options closed off except
And we're
one.
not talking about being in a room. We're talking about having to do our taxes and pay our bills.
We're talking about anything that impinges on our freedom to do what we want. That's
Exactly.
what little kids want, and that's what everybody wants. But we also are triggered by boredom. The first time I faced having to edit a book, the image that came to my mind was, this is going to be like eating a sandbox. Like it just comes there. So then what 7s do when faced with this specter of boredom is a number of things. Sometimes we turn it into fun. That's why I have been a very happy and successful grade school teacher in my life. Okay? When people used to say, you know, how can you relate so well to those 5th graders? I said, emotional compatibility. It's hard for a 5th grader to find someone with a doctorate at their emotional level, but it's okay. So the one thing that 7s do sometimes is we escape. There's lots of ways of escaping. There's a perceptual way of escaping. We reframe it. The famous story of Tom Sawyer, he had to go to whitewash the fence. So when Ben came over, he told me it was a great privilege. Oh, okay, if it's a privilege, then Ben wanted to do it. Okay, the payoff for 7 is excitement. Whereas style 9, what triggers them is being overlooked and being taken advantage of, and not knowing what they want. So their habitual response is to sort of agree to what's ever going on. 9s are your quintessential cheap date. On the one hand, they're very easy to please. On the other hand, they're very able to take a great deal of pleasure in the smallest of things: a perfect cup of coffee, a rose, a sunset, a smile from someone they like. But the payoff for a style 9 is harmony. So what happens when a 9 marries a 7 and he wants excitement and she wants harmony? This is called negotiation, and that's what makes relationships exciting and different. Now, the same thing is true when you go to face midlife crisis. When a 7 goes to face midlife crisis, the question is, oh, I'm done with my job and it was an exciting job. What do I do for excitement now? Okay, what do I do for excitement? Or how can I turn midlife into an adventure? Now, a style 9 or a style 3 doesn't do that, because the end of one thing doesn't mean, wow, I've got all these options open now. Okay, so when people have something like a midlife crisis, the first question for the Enneagram coach is, how do you see that? Not what are you going to do? What does it mean to you?
How do you see that, and what does it mean to you? So a 7 would say freedom, where a 9 would say?
The 9 would say, I don't know. Because 9s, I often give 9s the assignment in the morning of, instead of making a to-do list, make a list of 2 things that you want, because they are not quite aware of what they want. Often they don't know what they want until they get angry because they didn't get it. Okay.
Makes sense.
Okay. The other thing that as an Enneagram teacher, I feel free to emphasize is cultures have an Enneagram style. And one of the reasons midlife crisis is such a crucial issue in our culture is that the United States, and I expect my experience is much less, but in most of the industrial nations, we have a cultural style 3. Style 3 is marked by pragmatism, by hard work, by a strict meritocracy, and by recognition and image.
Image looking good, yeah.
Yes. Now, style 3s are performers. They really do well, and if they don't do well, they'll settle for looking good. Okay? So in America, we have now an unhealthy 3 sees themselves as machines. Okay? For instance, in a corporation, if someone's not performing well, they say, "Oh, he's burned out." Wait a minute. Only carburetors and vacuum cleaners burn out. Puppies don't, carrots don't, trees don't. Only machines burn out. But that's the common vocabulary. Congress just passed a law about 6 months ago, and it was unobtrusively mechanical. It changed the classification of hourly wages to salary, so they could work the people longer and not pay them any more. The implicit assumption is this is a good idea, except that if I drive my car 20 minutes longer, it goes 20 miles further.
Mm-hmm.
If I drive and if I force an animal to run 20 minutes longer, it's not going to work. And so the worker gets tired, makes mistakes, gets angry, gets sick, gets counterproductive. All of those things are simply not looked at. You go 20 minutes longer, 20 minutes further. So one of the first things I talk about for people in midlife crisis is, now how are you going to take care of your body? We often talk about midlife crisis, and we must, as a psychological crisis, but it's also a really good time to talk about it as a bodily crisis. How are you going to take care of your body? Style 3s are so mechanical. They talk about themselves in mechanical terms. So I have a trick question that I ask style 3s to find out if they are a style 3, and they never catch on. But it's worked 12 out of the last 13 that I've talked to. I ask them, "Do you have any plants in your office?" And they never do. They never have plants in their office. Now, there's a book I recommend to all styles. It's about your body. It's called Your Brain on Nature. One of the reasons we have to take midlife crisis is we are animals, and animals work better in nature. Do you know that if you have, let's say, a seventh grader taking a test, he or she will score higher if there are plants in the room. She will score higher if the dog is sitting by her. Our brains work differently when we are in touch with nature. We are animals. I'd like to recommend a book. Now, it's by Tony Schwartz. He wrote a book called The Way We're Working Isn't Working. And that first chapter is all about our bodily rhythms. So one of the first things I do when I'm talking to people in the midlife crisis is get them in touch with their bodily rhythms. If they're a style 7, I tell them, you are entitled to recess, because 7s are kind of children, and so it's recess. I actually had the gross effrontery as an American to tell an English woman, you should have a morning tea, because you need to establish your bodily rhythms. But here in America, we do not honor the body very well. Our machines are getting better and better, but our healthcare costs are skyrocketing. And I've seen 2 different statistics. One says 75 and the other said closer to 85% of all of our healthcare costs are because of our lifestyle. Okay? Well, as our machines get better and better and our bodies get worse and worse, in midlife, that's a really good time to ask, how are you taking care of your body? It's really interesting how the different styles do and don't. For example, it is really hard to get a style 2 to take care of their body because their mission in life is to take care of others. And it feels selfish to take care of yourself. And so I have to point out, look, that's a habit. It's a cultural habit. Get over it. And here are some things to do. Let's just go around and give a thumbnail sketch of how each Enneagram style will face a midlife crisis. All right, we'll start with style 1. Style 1 is preoccupied with what's the right thing to do. And so they will read all the books and they will do what they're supposed to do at a midlife crisis. They will develop hobbies. They will develop new communities and so forth. Style 2, their mission in life is to take care of others. It'll be counterintuitive for them to take care of themselves because let's say they're 40, now their parents are 60. They're going to focus on how to take care of them. And so I'll talk about taking care of the caretaker. Style 3, we already talked about. The big crisis there is, what am I going to do? Not what am I going to do, what well I'm going to do that will keep me recognized for what I'm doing. 3s are motivated largely by the recognition of others. Okay, style 4 will very often in midlife crisis, style 4s will want to write their memoirs and express themselves, and they will have trouble deciding what they're going to do in the external world. They're very sure they've got a million movies they want to watch and poems they want to read and so forth, but what are they going to do in the outside world? Okay, style 5s are all about being wise and about accumulating information. So style 5s have to take into consideration their body, because as Joyce Carol Oates, a famous 5, says, basically my body is to hold my head up so I can read, and so 5s will have to be forced or encouraged into look at the bodily changes, because the cognitive decline, unless they're unhealthy, will come much later, so there's not much of a problem. Style 6s being they will predict the worst, and so you have to give them information about what can you expect, what could possibly go wrong, so how can you plan for that doesn't. See, 6s try to control the future by planning, so they will have to do that. Style 7s often kind of just skate over the midlife crisis because they often have changed jobs 2 or 3 times already, and so it's not a big deal. Style 8s face midlife crisis. They're afraid of losing their strength. And so you have to find out, where can you find other forms of power than the kind of physical dynamic power that you have now. Sometimes that's money, but sometimes that's a political move. Sometimes that's taking charge of a cause of some kind, because 8s have a keen sense of justice. Style 9s, when they get to the midlife, the first thing, strangely enough, that I do with style 9s is I ask them, what makes you feel most awake? And then point out that the lament that style nines often have at the end of their life is as having not lived their life, and unlived life is their lament. So nines have to really work hard at, now, what do I want? Maybe your job forced you to do certain things, but for a nine, please ask, what is it that you want? This has been very, very brief, but what I want to emphasize is that when you have a habit, and that habit is so rooted that it's rooted in past experiences, knowing what worked before, knowing that you're going to be a little bit rigid in what you expect now, to get very clear on what the habit is, so they know what they're dealing with, and then say, okay, now what is it that you didn't see?
This is incredible. I have a ton of questions, but people have to get to work. So the question I have is, if they want to learn what their Enneagram is, what do they need to do?
Okay, you can go to my website. You can read up on the various styles, or you can fill out, I have a 12 point, just a dozen symbolic questions. See, if you're going to deal with spirituality and psychology, you don't deal with behavior, you deal with the underlying patterns. So right. I get at those through symbols. They can answer those questions and they can send them to me, and I'll tell them, look, go study these couple of numbers, because sometimes they're superficially alike, but usually I can tell them, go look up this number and read about it.
But I think the best way is to fill out those 12 questions, set up a session with you, which you can do on your website.
Oh yes, you can do that also.
And then have you expound on what you found and strategies for them to grow within that.
Yes, that's a little bit more than your Enneagram style. That also gives you about 45 minutes of coaching.
And let me just tell the audience that every single one of my clients get their Enneagram done by Clarence. All of my contemporaries, my colleagues, send their people to Clarence to get the Enneagram. It is a great way for us to start coaching, and a great way for our clients to figure out a place to start in themselves. So I really suggest that you go to Clarence's website, take a look around, and then set up an appointment for yourself to get coached by the master. Clarence, what would you like to close with? What would you like to leave everybody with?
You're just fine the way you are.
And I feel that way. So Clarence, thank you for taking the time and spending the time with us. This is so fascinating to me. And we're going to get the transcript together for this. And we're also put in the show notes, all the tools that you need and how to get in touch with Clarence in the notes. Have a good day, Clarence. Thank you so much. To everybody else, if you like this podcast, please like it, please review it, please share it. And I love you. Have a great rest of the day.